I think, after writing the book and hopefully people after reading the book will get the sense that Isaiah Fountain did not have a fair shake, even though he had 2 trials.
Okay, Short Issues Podcast. We are here October 4th. We are here today with an author for a change, Joseph Koper, who has written a book called The Case of Isaiah Fountain, who we'll get into. But before we get into the details of that, Joseph, could you give us a personal biography? Where do you come from? How did you get to the Eastern Shore? And how did you come to be writing The Case of Isaiah Fountain?
Well, I'm originally from Western Pennsylvania, and I landed in Maryland via the U.S. Army. Lived most of my time in Maryland over on the Western Shore in Baltimore County. And about 13 years ago, ended up in Talbot County. Insofar as how I came to write the book, it was kind of by accident, actually. I happened to be reading a book by Cheryl Eiffel called On the Courthouse Lawn, which talks about the lynching culture on the Eastern Shore, basically. And it had a brief account of the Isaiah Fountain case, only 6 pages or so. And it kind of intrigued me. I never heard about it. I'm fairly familiar with Talbot County history, and it caused me to do a little bit of research. And when I did research it, I found that the case was really a big thing at the time. During the Jim Crow era, it was not only notorious here on the Eastern Shore and in Maryland, but throughout the country. Newspapers in New England and down south and even the far west were printing stories about the Isaiah Fountain case. But here we are 100 years later, and not too many people know about it. So I just decided to basically give a talk at my community clubhouse. And I had it all set, ready to go. And COVID came along. Clubhouse closed. My presentation was canceled. So since I already had invested number of research hours into the story, I just decided to go ahead. Spent my COVID vacation writing a book. I never really started out intending to write a book, but I ended up getting a publisher, and here I am.
Yeah. So before we get to the book, you said that you are familiar with, the history of Talbot County, sociologically and such. Just as to get like a background of the setting that this story is taking place, can you give a description of the sociological setting of Talbot County in 1919? What was going on? Was Jim Crow going on? World War I, Spanish flu, Red Summer? What conditions were affecting Talbot County at that time?
Well, actually, just about all the ones that you mentioned. I was kind of fascinated in that there were a lot of parallels to what we were going through and what was going on in 1919. As you mentioned, that was in the midst of the Jim Crow era. The Eastern Shore was really a hotbed of Jim Crow. A lot of writers and historians maintain that Jim Crow was as strong or stronger here on the Eastern Shore as it was in the Deep South. Virtually at the same time that the Fountain case started, just a couple months later, we had the start of the Red Summer, in which something like 36 different cities throughout the country suffered racial violence and lynchings and so forth. And while that was happening, of course, you had the Spanish flu epidemic. So all these things were happening, and it wasn't a very good time for African Americans here in Talbot County and elsewhere.
Were there any lynchings in Talbot County or like around the Eastern Shore going around this time that would have been terrifying and on the minds of Black folks?
There weren't any lynchings in Talbot County. There were some near lynchings. Of course, the Isaiah Fountain case happened to have several times that the gentleman, Isaiah Fountain, was almost lynched.
Attempted lynchings, yeah,
Attempted lynchings, exactly. There were lynchings that happened on the Eastern Shore. A few years earlier, a man was lynched in Crisfield. And of course, lynchings were also happening on the Western Shore, too. If there weren't lynchings, there were legal sanctions against African Americans. Basically, they were up against white law enforcement officers, white judges, white juries. And in Talbot County, even though there weren't any lynchings, there were several hangings of Black people for most of the crimes were sexually related offenses against white women.
Lynchings by the state, I think the Baltimore Afro-American called it, correct?
Yeah, or you could call it a legal lynching, I guess.
Right. So there was two-tiered justice system working at this point for African American, working against African Americans, correct?
Definitely. They knew their boundaries. They knew what they had to do to avoid lynching, if at all possible. And, besides going through the sanctions of the Jim Crow era, separate water fountains and separate transportation situations and so forth, they also knew, not to look a white man in the eye and, yes sir, no sir, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And also to avoid any kind of contact, especially sexual contact with white women. That was really a hot button issue.
Well, that's kind of a good point to kind of roll out into some exposition here. Who is Isaiah Fountain and what happened to him?
Isaiah Fountain was a farmer in Talbot County. He lived about 4 or 5 miles south of Easton in a little Black enclave of Williamsburg. For being a Black man during the Jim Crow era, he was fairly successful. He had his own farm that he farmed with his father, owned farm equipment, owned animals, and so forth, and even had an account in an Easton bank, a bank account. But this kind of made him the object of jealousy, perhaps, scorn from his white neighbors. And what happened, he happened to have some marital difficulties with his wife, who had wanted to give up farming in Williamsburg here and wanted to return to her family in Camden, New Jersey. She went to Easton ostensibly to withdraw some money from the bank to pay for a baby pig that Isaiah had purchased the day before. And she didn't return home, so Isaiah walked to Easton, was looking for her. While he was there, he interacted with a number of people, including 3 prominent white people, including the Easton chief of police. And he never did find his wife, found out that she had run away. And while he was in Easton, a rape occurred about a mile northwest of Trapp, which was 9 miles away from Easton. Things being what they were at the time, he was quickly pointed out as being the number one culprit for the crime, mainly because he left town the very next morning to go to Camden, New Jersey to search for his wife. So that was a big factor. Another factor was that a couple of years earlier, it was reported that he had been convicted by justices of the peace for a minor crime, cruelty to animals. He was driving his horse unshod, and the justices of the peace ended up sentencing him to 2 years in the Maryland penitentiary. Isaiah's lawyer filed a writ of habeas corpus and got Isaiah released from his sentence. Well, when that happened, that kind of angered the Talbot County State's Attorney, Charles Butler. And according to the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, after that happened, Butler had it in for Isaiah Fountain. So whenever this crime occurred, the sheriff was investigating along his own line of investigation. And at the time, it was leading to another black man as being a suspect. But the Talbot County State's Attorney kind of hijacked the investigation from the sheriff and basically told the sheriff, go get Fountain. And so Fountain became the prime suspect.
It's an interesting one because, like you said, there's three people who identified him as being in Easton at the time the rape was reported. One of them being the chief of police. The other was a bank teller and assistant state's attorney. Is that correct?
Assistant county treasurer, I believe.
Assistant county treasurer.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that would, having three white, well-known white witnesses testify to your location at a different place, seems like it would exonerate anybody in this day and age. Why is it that Isaiah Fountain was singled out in particular? Maybe you kind of hinted on it a little earlier, I think.
Well, as I said, it was reported that the state's attorney kind of had it in for him because I guess he figured Fountain got off on that animal cruelty charge a couple years earlier. And so he kept an eye on him. So whenever this came up, also there was a lot of public sentiment because Fountain happened to leave town the very next morning after the rape. A lot of the locals figured, hey, this black guy is fleeing town, so he must have done it. So the combination of the two, the public sentiment and the feelings of the state's attorney, kind of sealed Fountain's fate.
Could you go into a little bit to the popular backlash that happened as a result of this and how that led up into the first trial and influenced the first trial?
Fountain actually, APB, All Points Bulletin, I guess you could call it, was put out for Fountain. And a few days later, he was captured in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So immediately the sheriff went up to Westchester to bring him back to Easton. But because of the lynching sentiment in Talbot County, it was decided that for Fountain's own safety, do not bring him back to Easton. Instead, he was taken to the Baltimore City jail to be kept there until his trial date could be set. So in the meantime, Fountain got indicted, and it's interesting also. Instead of waiting 3 weeks, I believe it was, until the next grand jury was to be seated, they ended up calling the previous grand jury from the previous November session, and they quickly indicted Fountain. And he was brought back for trial. And his trial started actually less than 3 weeks after the crime took place. So it was, they moved very quickly. And the trial began in Easton on Easter Monday, April 21st, 1919. And the town was full of people wanting to attend the trial. Most of them were angry. And the day of the trial, everybody tried to get into the courthouse, and there wasn't enough room. So a lot of people ended up standing outside. And they had messengers bringing the news of the testimony to the crowd outside. And the trial extended through the day, and there was a night session, and the judge decided for the night session not to have any spectators there. So that angered the crowd outside because they weren't getting any news about the trial. So at about 10 o'clock, the judge adjourned for the evening, And the sheriff and the Baltimore police officers who were sent down to provide security for Fountain took him from the courthouse to the jail, which sits just to the rear of the courthouse, about 75 yards away. And this angry crowd basically was there. It was reported that they had ropes and weapons, and they attempted to grab Fountain, take him from the sheriff's custody, and lynch him. But the sheriff and the police got Fountain to the sheriff's house, which was adjoining the jail, and basically they shoved him in the door. And the sheriff's wife took over and told him to get down on the floor to avoid getting shot through the windows. And he took that opportunity to get down on the floor and then crawl through an open window and made his escape. And it ended up having a very large manhunt in and around Talbot County and the Eastern Shore. There were sightings of Fountain all over the place. And 2 days later, Fountain was captured in Delaware, about 40 miles northeast of Easton, and he was brought back to town just ahead of being lynched by a number of lynchers in Delaware.
Right. He was nearly lynched on site, right? Wasn't that the case?
Well, he was found in a barn, and the sheriff's deputies and Baltimore police captured him just before a group of lynchers arrived at the barn. And they brought him back in a high-speed convoy. And all along the way, there were people lining the route wanting to lynch him. And when he got back to Easton, there was a crowd of 4,000 to 5,000 people gathered there. But before Fountain's arrival in town, the town leaders and judges and so forth, prominent leaders in the community, addressed the crowd, basically begging them, don't lynch this guy. You shouldn't do it. And so the trial continued the next day. And when it did continue, the courthouse was surrounded by Maryland militia troops, which now would be known as National Guard troops, that were sent by the governor. Fountain was found guilty. The jury deliberated for 9 minutes, found him guilty, and he was sentenced to hang. Then immediately sent to Baltimore for safekeeping till his execution date could be set.
Was there anything else funny about the trial except for, the disregarding of the, chief of police's testimony and such?
Well, one of the things was the prime investigator, Sheriff Stitchberry, was not called to testify.
Right.
And as I said, he had been developing other investigatory avenues, wanted to look at some other suspects, and the state's attorney basically pulled him off that and had him hunt for Fountain. So that was kind of a thing, because later on, the sheriff actually went to Fountain's lawyer and said, hey, these things happened. I wasn't allowed to testify, and, I want you to know where my investigation was leading and so forth. So, but ultimately that really didn't do Fountain any good.
One of my favorite chapters in the book is called Media Wars, and I kind of am starting to learn about this dynamic. Well, in particular, earlier you mentioned when the Baltimore police had to come down and occupy Easton for a little bit to sort of quell everything. That made a lot of Eastonians feel some type of way, and in particular the Star Democrat. So could you talk about sort of the dissonance between Baltimore and Easton?
Okay, well, I think whenever the story first broke out, the newspapers, both in Baltimore on the Western Shore and on the Eastern Shore, kind of handled it pretty much the same. It was black guy raping a white woman. Just about all the newspapers would use. They would describe the black man as the black brute or the Negro or the Negro fiend or something like that. And while they were discussing the female, it would be little Miss Simpson and the poor white girl and so forth. So they all kind of used that same approach. But then whenever the lynching attempt occurred in Easton, that kind of made the divide between the Eastern Shore newspapers, especially the Star Democrat, and the big city newspapers. Because the big city newspapers started to take the attitude that this guy really didn't have a very fair trial. He was almost lynched, and they reported the lynching in a lot of detail. Whereas the Eastern Star Democrat was almost in denial that a lynching attempt even took place. It was very vociferous and really wildly against the Baltimore papers for daring to report that the Easton people would try to lynch this black man. And on the one hand, they said that no lynching attempt took place, and on the other hand, they were saying, well, if there was a lynching, it was people from other counties or people from Delaware who came to lynch Fountain, but it wasn't our people. So that kind of started the war, and basically, the Star Democrat was pretty much against just about anything and everything the Baltimore Sun and the Evening Sun and the Afro-American were reporting. Oh, they called for lawsuits. They called for the reporters to be arrested, all kind of things. I mean, it was really amazing the attitude that they took over the descriptions that the Baltimore papers were printing.
Yeah, so can we segue into talking about the second trial and what happened with that and why he was found guilty a second time?
Right. Well, after the first trial, of course, Fountain's lawyers filed an appeal, basically saying that the jury's decision was influenced by the attempted violence of the lynch mob. So a second trial was granted, and also a change of venue occurred. So they moved the trial from Easton to Towson in Baltimore County. And at that time, for the second trial, they decided, Fountain's lawyers decided, instead of having a jury trial again, they wanted a trial with 3 judges, figuring that, you've got 3 learned people who know the law, that Fountain will probably get a better break that way. Well, it didn't happen. During the second trial in Towson, pretty much the same testimony was given, but yet the judges still found Fountain guilty. When they pronounced sentence, they also had an explanation of why they found him guilty. And this explanation was published in various newspapers. And it's interesting because, they would say, well, this one person saw him there and this person saw him. But then the 2 things that struck me was they kind of changed the testimony of the victim, where she originally said she was raped approximately, it ended up varying, but she originally said it was around 5 o'clock. The judges ended up changing the timeline, saying he could have been raped as late, or she could have been raped as late as 5:30. And at the same time, they ignored the testimony of the 3 white witnesses who said that Fountain was in Easton at the time of the rape. So by manipulating the timeline of the time of the rape, and then ignoring the testimony of the three white witnesses, they said he could have easily made it from Easton, driving his wagon down to Trap, hunting out this young girl and then raping her.
Yeah, it's 9 miles away.
9 miles away. And,
right.
He had an old farm buggy and a farm horse. It was by no means a thoroughbred. And it would have taken him well over an hour to negotiate that 9 miles.
Yeah, I mean, so for their timeline to make any sense, he would have had to have hustled like as quick as the wind back to Trap to do this rape. You know what I mean? In like no time flat.
Probably would have needed a sea biscuit.
Yeah, right. And he did, and he had a decrepit, broke down little buggy, and he wasn't going too fast to begin with.
Exactly.
Right. What was interesting, I actually wrote this in my book. It was really interesting that the judges would compose an alternate timeline and just sort of give Bertha the benefit of the doubt as she wasn't really time aware. You know what I mean? But
Yes.
then totally think that her testimony because she wasn't able to identify Isaiah Fountain readily. And in fact, I think at first said it wasn't him. You know what I mean? So they're willing to accept that Bertha might be an illusion about the time window that it happened, but she's totally right about being able to identify Isaiah Fountain and all the conditions that were found that pointed to him being the rapist, right?
Exactly, and there were even questions raised about her identification of Fountain when
she wasn't able to do it in the first trial, like initially, right? She had to be coaxed into it, and was coaxed by her family, I think, in the investigation. Correct?
Well, she identified him at the trial, but the story is that a private detective was hired to kind of coach her, and apparently showed her a picture of Fountain beforehand, saying, this is the guy. So, when he stands up, identify him. And there were also other questions, even on the initial identification. She was only in the presence of the state's attorney and her grandmother when she identified a picture of Fountain, while the sheriff was sitting downstairs in the state's attorney's house. He wasn't permitted to be in on the identification. And then whenever she identified him again in person, he was the only black man in the room, and he was surrounded by several white Baltimore City policemen. So who would she pick?
Yeah, of course. And he was like the only black guy in the room as well, too.
Exactly.
He's found guilty a second time. His attorney decides not to appeal. I'm not sure what the reason is for that, even though, I mean, clearly the judges just composed a piece of evidence that wasn't there at all. But what happens after he's found guilty a second time?
As I said, there are a lot of side stories going on. He's found guilty. He was returned to Easton, put in jail. And he was in jail here for about a month, waiting for the governor to basically set his execution date. He had time on his hands, and while he was in the Easton jail, he got hold of a file, and he filed through the bars on his cell door. And he camouflaged the cut bars with tape and soap. And one evening, he was supposed to have a 24-hour guard, a night and day guard. They were supposed to be posted outside the cell. So one evening at night, he asked the night guard for a drink of water. So the night guard goes to another section of the jail to get the water. And while he does that, he leaves a door open. So Isaiah takes advantage of this, and he removes the filed portions of his cell door, crawls through, goes out the door, goes through the front door of the sheriff's house. The slamming door wakes up the sheriff, who's upstairs with his wife, and they sound the alarm. Isaiah's escaped again. So this time he's gone for just about a week, and he's finally captured up in Queen Anne. But the thing is, except for the very last day of his bout of freedom, he was less than a mile from the jail in Easton. He was hiding out in a barn. Once he was captured and brought back to Easton, within, I think, a day or two, the governor established his execution date, which was less than a month away. And so he had a month to live, and he ended up being executed in the Easton jail, or the Talbot County Jail in Easton. And because there was also a lot of controversy, because a lot of people wanted to see him hung in public. They seemed to want their bit of flesh. And so there's a big controversy going on whether or not to execute him in public or to do it in private. Some of the town's leaders thought that it was better to do it in private because, we're not barbarians down here and so forth. So they wanted to go for a private execution. Finally, it was up to the sheriff to decide, and with, I think, some prodding from the governor, he decided to have a private execution within the jail. So he had to have a custom-built gallows put in one of the corridors of the jail. Fountain was hanged on July 23rd, 1920, at 3:13 in the morning. That was it. He was cut down, and according to the Baltimore Sun, he was in the ground in his grave on a farm in Williamsburg before people of Easton were up.
He was also the last person executed in Talbot County, correct?
He was the last person executed on the Eastern Shore.
Yeah.
Because of the controversy, well, his wasn't the only case. At that time, the executions occurred in the counties where the crime took place. Because of the controversy of public versus private hanging, that helped to lead towards a change in the legislation for execution. A bill was passed in the Maryland legislature saying that from then on, instead of having the executions done in the local counties, they would be done they established a death house at the Maryland Penitentiary.
Right. So executions were centralized to Baltimore from this point on, pretty much. Yeah.
Yes.
Were you able to find his gravesite in Trap?
No. Actually, according to reports, it was on his farm in Williamsburg. Okay. And I've not been able to find anything out about that. In fact, even his family, I couldn't find anything about any local relatives or anything like that. I think basically because he was a convicted rapist, his family was probably under a cloud, and his farm had already been sold to pay for his legal fees. So I think his family probably just ended up drifting away, moving elsewhere.
So you haven't been able to locate any living descendants in the area?
No.
Okay. I noticed that because his brother and his wife were from like Westchester, Camden, and have you been able to find any people up that way going by Fountain? No,
I actually looked at census records up there, and I'm not a genealogist, I guess. Mm-hmm. That's not my forte. But looking at the census records, it was kind of a dead end. I was looking for some sign of his wife and his children up there, and I couldn't find it.
I guess my last question to you to wrap this up is, what would you like to see happen as a result of writing this book? Like, what is your message to the next governor of Maryland?
As you might know, recently, Governor Hogan, several months ago, issued a blanket pardon for, I think it was 34 lynching victims that were victims of lynchings here in the state of Maryland. Governor Glendening, in 2001, issued a pardon for a Black man who was convicted of murdering a white woman and was hanged in Annapolis in, I believe it was 1917. So I sent a letter to Governor Hogan asking that he consider issuing a pardon for Isaiah Fountain. seeing that a precedent has been set by another governor, and also with his interest in pardoning these lynching victims. So I've yet to hear back, but I think, after writing the book and hopefully people after reading the book will get the sense that he did not have Isaiah Fountain did not have a fair shake, even though he had 2 trials. The jury system failed him, and the learned judicial system, 3 judges failed him in obtaining any kind of justice.
Okay. So to wrap it up, where can we purchase the book? Where can we find more about Joseph Koper?
Okay. Well, I have a website, josephkoper.com, and the book is published by Secant Publishing. Actually, they're in Salisbury. You can buy the book there. The book's available right now on Amazon in Kindle edition, and on October 18th, it'll be available as a hardcover, not only on Amazon, but through Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and various booksellers around.